Hello gang, Shopshot21 here. Apologize for the rain noise in the background on this one. Voiceover land is raining today. We're starting this one off though with more of the Mini Mania, and we're starting with replacing the oil pump, drive chain, and sprocket. This is a fairly simple job, but it's easier if you've got the motor out. Because you do have to take off the crank snout and the oil pan to get to it, and I found it easier to be able to do it when I could see it. Also, motor's out. Might as well replace everything that you can. Especially because when I did this, the motor had like 80,000 miles on it. So that's like, what, 170-ish thousand kilometers. There are a bunch of bolts on the bottom of the pan. I think they're all M10s. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they look to be about M10s here. I also apologize. I've bit my tongue the other day. So we'll get all these out, pop this pan off, and then replace the chain and sprocket. Pop the pan off's not too bad. It's held on with some RTV. You do have to make sure you clean it up really well before you put it back on. You put it on with a fresh coat of RTV. When you're putting a pan or a cover back on and using RTV as a sealant in lieu of a gasket, there's a couple tricks. You need to put it on thick enough so that when you tighten the bolts down, it squishes and forms a good seal. But you also need to not torque the bolts all the way down so that you squeeze all of it out. You tighten it down so it squishes and you can see it squish. You let it set, and then you finish torquing it down about 24 hours later. So there I just pulled the crank snout out. The crank snout, the crankshaft on this is two pieces. You've got the main shaft and the snout. There's no key or anything on the snout to go into the main shaft. That, in my mind, is a design flaw. If I have to go back into this engine ever again, which I hope I don't, I will be correcting that. And then the oil pump is just chain drive off a sprocket. Not too hard to get to. Just take the cover off the front of the oil pump, take the crank snout off, pull the old chain out, put the new chain and sprocket in, just lightly torque down the crank snout bolt, and then it's time to pop the cover back on to the oil pump, which I'll be doing here in a moment. One thing that I will say I did do on a bunch of this stuff, and I'll show this later in the video, is I put Loctite bearing set on a bunch of this stuff that was just held in with compression and friction. So off camera there, I did put some bearing set on the oil pump bolt, or the oil pump sprocket, excuse me, and then it went back on. Now, I didn't RTV this. I'm just putting it back on so I can flip the motor. I don't bother to fully RTV this until after I've got the timing cassette installed and torqued down, just in case I drop any fasteners down into the engine. I can flip it and get them out. I had to do that with one of the cam bearing cap bolts. I dropped it down, had to pull the pan and pull it out of there. Not a big deal, just something to keep in mind. Don't seal up the engine until you've got all the top end work done on it. You don't want to drop fasteners, have to tear apart a pan again. Makes it much easier if you're just able to drop a pan that's already been pulled off. Now, while we're here, we might as well do the front main seal. Again, it has 80,000 miles on it. You're already in there. Best do it. Other thing, if you do this, I don't care if you're doing the front main seal, the whole timing set. If you're in there for the timing set, you might as well do the main seal. But regardless, you need a new crank bolt. The torque to yield fasteners, they're right at failure point when you install them. Now, taking out the main seal is easy. Pull the crank snout, get yourself a small drift. If you've got a brass one, that is best. I didn't have a brass one, so I took a steel one. You would be very careful if you're using a steel one that you don't nick the seating surface on the block where the front main seal sits. If you nick that, you're opening up a passageway for oil to come out. That's bad. You need to make sure that you don't do that. Same if you're using the screw trick to pull a seal without being able to pull the shaft that's in the seal. That's fairly common on like transmission input shaft seals. And front main seals, because usually the front main seal is a one-piece unit and you have to pull the entire crankshaft to get to it. This one's a little different. If you're using the screw trick, you got to make sure that it goes in there correctly so that as the screw goes in, the threads are not damaging the mating surface or the sealing surface on either the crankshaft or the block. This is me just cleaning up the cam gear, or the crank sprocket, because I think I put the cassette in at this point as well. We'll find out in a moment if I do slot the whole cassette in. It does look like I'm grabbing the crank seal. It's a seal with an installation sleeve or tool. We'll see what that looks like here in a moment. Excuse me, having a drink. Alright. For all of these things, get the original manufacturer parts. That way, when all goes in, it goes the way it's supposed to. This was kind of a trick. The seal was on an installation cup, and how you put it in there, you're supposed to have a seal press. I don't have one. So I did it again with the punch and a very small hammer. I think it's like a 3 or 4 ounce cross peen hammer. You don't want to hit it hard if you've got to do it this way. So what I did is I put the cup in, it sits over the crankshaft. I put the snout in, that helped with alignment. Now if you watch, I'm just lightly tapping the seal in. The trick with getting seals in is they have to go in evenly. A little tap here, a little tap there, work it around. Don't be scared, but don't force it. Go gently. If you go gently, then it goes in smoothly, it goes in evenly, and it stops where it's supposed to stop. Once it's in, take the bolt out of the crank, snout, pull it out, pull the installation cup out. Make sure your seating gap is even all the way around, which is what I'm doing here. And then once that's done, and again, take your time. Don't rush. Inspect it. If you're worried, just go slow. Once you're satisfied with it, you can then gently reinstall the crank snout, just like that. Now this has to come back out one more time once we do the timing cassette. When you're going in and out, be very careful that you don't damage the seal. Okay, seal the crank snouts back out, and see that little packet on the stool there? That is the bearing set. Box I just put down is the whole timing cassette and assembly. Go get your Haynes manual or your Bentley manual. It's a bearing set. Super helpful stuff. Get the Permatex, get the Loctite. We think this is probably the best way to do this. Just as an extra layer of protection for yourself and for your engine. Everything's got to be clean. Everything's got to be dry. Use brake clean. That's what's in that can. Dry all the surfaces. They got to be oil free. They cannot be oily. They cannot be damp. Then you've got to make sure that they go back together tight. You only have a limited window with this bearing set. Yes, it's an anaerobic set, so it does not need air to set. In fact, it sets in the absence of air. Same with Loctite. Okay, here's me putting the bearing set on the oil pump drive. I've got to open the tubes. Very small nick. And there's the oil pump drive sprocket, I believe. So just put a very, very light bit of bearing set on there. I'm putting a very light bit in. I got the chain up. Chain's on, sprocket's in. Okay, that's sprocket number 1. This little butterfly thing is your timing cassette guides. Your timing chain guides. They form the cassette. Those 2 bolts that I'm pulling out are the bottom mounting bolts, and that box is your timing chain. Got a new tensioner. And maybe I just put in a... No, there's a timing sprocket, or the crank sprocket. Now this is a very clever system. If you keep tension on the chain, it will keep the sprocket where it's supposed to be, so you can feed the whole cassette down in. Quite clever. A couple of drops of bearing set. And then you slide the whole cassette down in. Make sure you get the sprocket on, and then even more bearing set. Then gently guide that crank snout in, push it in, and then the clock is ticking. Got limited time to get the rest of this done and get this bearing set seated. Again, don't rush, take your time. That is the new crank snout bolt. We will torque that to spec in a bit. Right now, I'm just snugging it down. Then it's time for these 2 bolts here, which hold the bottom of the guides in place. You'll have to pick up on the guides from where it was resting to get those in place, but that's per design. They are a Torx bolt. I forget what size they are. I want to say they're like a 25 or a 30. Now, the next step, sorry about the jumpy camera angles, is getting the cam sprockets installed. We've got an intake and an exhaust. I did not get new sprockets, so it is time to clean those up. There's no indexing pins on these either. Why there isn't, I don't know, but there isn't. This whole timing set is kind of put together in it's a Schrodinger's timing set. You don't know if it's together right unless you've got the timing set tool on everything and holding everything in place. And even then, you're not quite sure it's right until you get the thing started. Once it starts, and it doesn't go bang, clatter, clatter, and crunch, then you know it's good. But until you start it, there's always that, is this going to work type of moment. It's a Schrodinger's timing set until you start the car. So pointing out there on that sprocket, that is the intake sprocket. This engine, which is the N14, has intake Vanos. It does not have intake and exhaust Vanos. Vanos is a variable valve timing system. That Vanos sprocket is controlled by oil pressure from the engine. You've got to be careful not to get any bearing set where it's going to get into the inner workings of that sprocket and prevent it from moving. And then on the back side, there is a solenoid that controls oil flow to that sprocket. Now, if memory serves, according to the book, you have to get the whole cassette under tension before you torque down those sprockets. Those sprockets are just gently held on there right now. There's no torque. They can spin on those cams. That's needed because, again, it's a Schrodinger's timing set. There's nothing that locks those cams to those cam sprockets other than the torque of the one bolt, the clamping force of the one bolt that goes through the center of those sprockets. So everything has to be under operating load and operating condition before you torque everything down. It has to be able to float and find its center. Now that it's you gotta make sure that this is all together and all tight before you can torque everything, because those cams cannot move and that crank cannot move from its held position. If they move, you got to start all over again. Make sure that timing tool is locked down. Make sure you have the pin in the correct hole in the flywheel. Make sure that the pistons are not at top dead center on number one. They have to be halfway up the cylinders with, I believe, cylinder number one on the rising stroke. And that is the only way you can time this engine. Double check me on that last point. It should be in your manual. If I have not said it enough, go get the manual. You need the workshop manual for this car, especially if you're doing an engine rebuild this deep. It has all of the torque specs, the correct timing procedure, ways to check it, everything. This engine, if you've ever built an engine, does not time like a standard engine does. When I rebuilt my Jeep, it was so much easier to time that engine than it was to time this one. All you have to do on those, cylinder number one, top dead center. Make sure that the valves are on the compression stroke, or are sealed. Top dead center compression stroke. Line up the marks on the timing set, torque it down, walk away. You're done. This is much more difficult. Now, I'm also getting this top guide in place. This guide, this top one here that we're working on right now, that is your usual cause of failure for the timing set on this engine, at least if it has the initial timing set in it. This guide was designed poorly with poor plastic and that plastic would snap off. It would then cause the guide to vibrate. That vibration would shear the rest, or would fatigue the rest of the guide carrier off of its upright. It would fall off, it would wind up at the bottom of the engine, wedged in between the crank sprocket and the chain. The crank would continue to turn, the chain would be locked up, and you'd crash every valve in the engine. It is a bad design. It is a poor design. If you're not sure if your Mini has had the timing set changed, under the recall, call your Mini dealer or any Mini dealer that will pick up the phone for you. Ask them, go, hey, I'm uncertain if my Mini Cooper, it's an R55 or an R56 with the N14 engine, has had the timing set replaced. They'll ask you for the VIN number. Give them your VIN number. They'll look it up in their system. They'll tell you if it has or if it hasn't. If it hasn't, I don't know if they'll tell you to come in. They'll have it under recall, under warranty, or if you're on your own for it. If you're on your own, either way, you need to get it addressed. Because if you're running around with one that hasn't had it done, I'd be willing to bet if you pull the valve cover off, part of that bracket and that timing guide is broken. So, little rant on that one. Now, we've gotten the guides all set. They're all screwed in. Those bolts have a torque setting. That was a torque screwdriver. And I believe it's time to finally drive home the tensioner. No, I drove the tensioner home already. Okay. I will note I did forget one bolt. It is the top timing chain guide bolt on the front side of the engine, so the side facing us. I forgot that one. You can get it in after, and it won't affect anything, but it's best if you do it before. Now these bolts have a torque setting, but then they have a torque to yield degree setting. So I just torque them, and now I'm getting my torque ankle gauge. I since have a torque wrench that will do torque ankle for you. Oh, and the snout, that has a torque setting too. It also has 2 torque to yield degrees, or torque ankles. That's okay. We'll get there. And the guide bolts have torque settings. These you can torque before or after. Doesn't really matter. Again, I forgot one. Didn't notice it until I was all done torquing. I wasn't going to undo it. I could get it in there. Probably best you don't. I just forgot it. It turned out fine. Okay, now I'm getting my torque angle gauge. These are cheap. They're not too expensive. They're half-inch drive to half-inch drive, and they've got a little finger that you just have to push up against something. And then they're just a dial with degree markings on the front. Easy peasy. The finger holds the pointer, and as you twist, the needle moves to your degree marking. I don't have a really good shot of this, and I forget what the torque angles are. I want to say it's like 90 and then 90 again, or maybe this is 120 and then 120 again, hence why I broke out the torque angle gauge. Eventually I do get this on there. And you gotta do this for all 3 things, because again, they're torque to yield. When the bolt, it's right up on the yield point of the bolt. As a result of that, you don't want to use these again in case it's fatigued extra. You're right on that elastic plastic deformation boundary with these fasteners. They're designed to be single use. I know you're like, but I can use them again. You could, potentially. But do you want to risk it? You've put a lot of time and a lot of money in. Don't risk it. Buy the new fasteners. Bought all new fasteners for this thing that were torque to yield fasteners. There's only a handful. I think it's literally only the head bolts, the snout bolt, and the cam bolts. Okay, so now we're on to the second torque angle. In reality, you should probably torque all of them, and then torque angle them once, and then torque angle them again. It might not matter. I did it this way. Car's still running just fine. Obviously, the crank snout bolt is a standard hex. The cam bolts, however, are an E-type Torx. I don't remember what size they are. I want to say they're like a 30. And as you can see, you kind of gotta lean on these things. And you need to make sure that finger is where it's supposed to be. And they are in there. Or you're putting some torque on it anyways when you're getting to it. But once you've got it, probably the trickiest part of this whole thing is done. At this point, it's putting it all back together. So, hope this quick little walkthrough was informative enough for you, and I hope that you enjoyed this evening. If you've got any questions, drop them down below or pop over onto the Discord, and I'll do my best to answer them. I'm not sure what that is. New tensioner versus old tensioner. Right, okay. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. It really helps me out, and it lets you know when I put something new up. New videos will be going up on Tuesdays or Thursdays at 8 a.m. Eastern. And if I do decide to do live streams, I will try to give 24 hours notice. So hit the subscribe button on the channel, and you'll be notified when I post that stuff too. Hope to see you next time. Sharps out.